right. Hello, everyone. If you're tuning in for the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities and James Joyce quarterly live stream event for our reading of Eveline, we're just getting ready to start here in a moment. We're doing a little bit of technical checking here over the next few minutes while we wait for people to join. In the meantime, I can urge you, if you haven't already done so, to go and perhaps mix yourself a cocktail. You'll see that all of our events now at the Humanities Center have a cocktail matched with them. Tonight, we're drinking a Massey cocktail, courtesy of the Starlight Lounge here in Tulsa. So if you don't have one of these in your hand already, you have a few moments before we get started to go ahead and mix one, and I urge you to do so. They're delicious. And I am checking with my staff to see how things look, because this is the first time we've attempted one of these, and we feel a little bit like we're shooting into the dark at the moment. So far, things look good. We're great. We're happy to have you joining us. I am shooting this actually in my living room at home, so you may hear a little bit of background noise going on as people pass through. Even within my own home, not everyone, it turns out, is a fan of James Joyce. I've also got a couple of dogs that I've closed in upstairs. They may be making guest appearances during the reading as well, though I hope they'll be relatively quiet. And of course, if you don't have the makings for a Massey cocktail this evening, first I urge you to visit our webpage where you'll find the recipe for how to make one of these, courtesy uh, of Lynn Robertson at the Starlight. But if not, grab yourself a Guinness, maybe a glass of whiskey, or even a glass of wine. All of those things will work well and go with tonight's reading and conversation about James Joyce's Eveline. All right, we'll get started, like I said, in just a minute as more people join here. We're delighted to have you with us. The way this is work, you'll see that there is a chat screen on the side there, so please make sure to add questions. I've got members of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities staff will be monitoring the conversation on the side, so if you have questions or comments, please feel free to make them. And we'll be providing some information on the side there as well about how to tip the bartender who helped design tonight's drink. And then at the end of the reading of Eveline, I'll also be taking some questions and answers. So you may want to be getting those ready as well to prepare for the conversation and reading that's to come. And as we get ready, I hope you can appreciate the carefully curated background that my daughters have helped me devise. Today, I've been actually doing most of my online teaching from my office upstairs, which is a bit more sterile than this. So we've rearranged the entire living room just to make this look good. So I hope it's doing the trick. One of my favorite parts of watching the news or all kinds of other events now is our opportunity to see into everyone's home and see whose bookcase is a mess and whose actually works well, who's chosen to sort of shoot in empty rooms and who's tried to make these beautiful sort of artistic arrangements behind themselves. I think I'm trying to strike a balance of the two here this evening. All right, I'm just checking a little bit here on the strength of our signal to make sure everything's running well, which it looks like it is. It's for those who are just signing in, it's a pleasure to have you here. We're just now at 5 o'clock, so I'll wait just a couple more minutes before we get going. You might, in the meantime, admire my Bloomsday shirt. Let's see, you can't quite see the beer under there. This has been the official logo of Bloomsday in Tulsa now for, oh, I don't know, at least 5 years. In fact, there's a giant mural like this that's been painted downtown that just says June 6, 1904, yes, and has become sort of our touchstone here in Tulsa for Bloomsday. In fact, we hold our annual Bloomsday celebration underneath that mural every year. Fingers crossed, we'll be holding it there again this summer, though there's really no way of knowing what things look like at the moment. And for those who are just joining, remember this is a Massey cocktail here, created for us courtesy of Lynn Robertson at the Starlight Bar here in Tulsa. It is delicious. I didn't think all of these things would go together. Campari and gin and let's see what else is in here. Whiskey and green chartreuse and a little bit of sweet vermouth. And actually they blend together really well. It's a delicious cocktail and the perfect accompaniment, I think, for tonight's Humanities Happy Hour. All right, well, now that we've officially rolled over to 5 o'clock, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'll read the story here in just a minute, but first I thought I'd tell you a little bit more about this program, about what it involves, and about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. So for those who might not know me, my name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English at the University of Tulsa, where I serve as the editor of the James Joyce Quarterly and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. Both of those two entities have come together to help co-sponsor tonight's event, the first in what we think will be a series of regular Thursday live streamed events that will continue now, I don't know, perhaps through June or at least until we're able to go out and be in person with one another again. We're calling this event Humanities Happy Hour. And so basically every Thursday at 5 p.m. Central Time, we'll invite you either into my living room or other living rooms around Tulsa, where we'll host a variety of different events. And for each of those events, we'll be asking local bartenders and restaurant owners to create custom cocktails. And you'll also have an opportunity to tip the bartenders at those establishments. As you know, they're suffering terribly right now. Most of them are out of work as we all confine ourselves to home. So this is a great way actually for us to help local businesses here in Tulsa. If you're following the chat on the side of the screen, you'll see that there's actually a link there for a PayPal account where you can go and tip your bartender. So I'll say this again several times throughout tonight's event. Please take a moment to tip your bartender. You do it in person, take a moment to do it now. It really will make a difference. So I want to say just a few words about some of the programs that we have coming up as part of this Humanities Happy Hour event. So starting tonight, we're doing this reading of Evaline. Next week, we're going to follow this up with what we're calling the Corona Cabaret. We'll be joined by Professor Michelle Dill from our musical theater department here at the University of Tulsa, and she's put together a terrific collection of songs that she will perform from her living room, all of which have, let's say, Corona themes associated with them. And we're actually working now on a cocktail to accompany this called the Quarantini. So we think this will be a really fun event and certainly quite a lighthearted way to try to pass some of this time in confinement. Things will take maybe a bit more difficult turn the week after that, where we'll be doing a film club where we'll be joined by Professor and Dr. Jeff Alderman from the Oxley College of Health Sciences at the University of Tulsa. We're going to ask people in advance to watch the movie Contagion, and then he and I will join in a conversation about the epidemiology and the art of that film and how the two things combine and what it can and can't tell us about our own experience of dealing with a pandemic like COVID-19 right now. We'll follow that up with, we have all kinds of other things that are going to be part of this program. We've got book club discussions planned, some other micro lectures. These are all meant to be relatively short, relatively light in terms of their intellectual content. And as I said, they're going to be paired with a cocktail. So it's a way to just relax a little bit and try to create, even in these socially distanced times, those kinds of human connections that we think are absolutely important. Even in these times where we're sort of confined to our homes, we need this kind of connection more than ever, perhaps. I should add, we're also going to be following this up every Friday with what we call Friday with the Fellows. We've asked our Oklahoma Center for the Humanities research fellows, both current and former, to contribute some content that will appear on our website every Friday at humanities.utulsa.edu. And we've got a terrific lineup of stuff coming. So they'll rotate. Basically, we'll have a different person each week. And each person will contribute maybe 3 or 4 different programs. We'll start tomorrow with a guided meditation provided by Edgar Frias, a Tulsa Artist Fellow who's living here in Tulsa now. And this will be followed by a variety of different things, including a board game discussion that will happen courtesy of David Chandler. a curated playlist for things to listen to over the weekend, curated by Katie Moulton, another one of our Tulsa Artist Fellows that are in residence here. And we're working now as well as developing one on cooking and some other themes. These are meant to just give you some content to take into the weekend and remind you that you can form these human connections within your house as well. So I want to start tonight's program by reminding you that this is Humanities Happy Hour. And I hope that those who are over 21 anyway and are willing to do so have a cocktail in their hand. We'll be working with different bars and bartenders and restaurants throughout Tulsa to produce this program. And tonight we've been fortunate enough to pair with the Starlight Bar here in Tulsa. If you happen to be in Tulsa, it's on 11th Street, not too far from the University of Tulsa. And Lynn Robertson, the bartender there, has created a terrific instructional video on how to create an Irish cocktail called the Massey. I will say I was deeply suspicious of this when I first saw the recipe appear. It's a combination of Irish whiskey and English gin and Campari and sweet vermouth and a little bit of green chartreuse. Amazingly enough, I had all of these things in my liquor cabinet. And when I combined them following Lynn's instructions tonight, it turned into an absolutely perfect cocktail that's delicious and very well blended and a perfect accompaniment to tonight's event. So I hope you had a chance to make one of these. If not, I hope that you take the opportunity to do that. And I do want to remind you that most of the bartenders and restaurateurs that where we spend so much of our social time are in really difficult times right now. We provided a link on the side in the chat for this event where you can tip Lynn and all the other bartenders that we'll be working with over the course of the event. So as I'll say again and again throughout tonight's program, please, if you have an opportunity, take a moment to tip your bartender. It will really make a difference. So first of all, I want to say sláinte and cheers to Lynn Robertson, to the Starlight, and to all of you who are joining us this evening. I also assured my staff members earlier today that I would sip this very powerful cocktail because one of the first things that happens when I start to drink a little bit is that I believe myself to be utterly hilarious and the greatest of raconteurs. So I'll try to be moderate in my consumption as this event goes on this evening. All right, so tonight we're going to start, or at least we're going to feature a reading of James Joyce's short story called Eveline. It's a very interesting short story. I chose it in part because it's a relatively short and digestible and accessible story for us to read. And it also is, as we'll see when we get to the end of the reading, you'll see that it's a story that affords a lot of opportunities for conversation and debate. As I'll explain at the end of the reading, I think it's also a story that may tell you more about yourself than it will ever tell you about the characters that are within it. In some ways, it's almost a kind of self-test once you start to realize what Joyce is doing with the story. So just by way of preface, I want to say a few words about the story, about its history and its context, just to give you some sense of Joyce and his early writings. This is actually one of Joyce's very first prose pieces. It was written in 1904, one of the very first stories that became the collection that we now call Dubliners. And the history of this collection of books in particular, or this collection of stories, so the publication of this book is almost as interesting as the stories themselves. Joyce completed most of them in between 1904, 1903, and 1905, but then ran into terrible difficulty trying to get them published. He immediately had a contract, and over the course of the next several years, both printers and editors, as they began to read these stories more closely, realized how potentially unsettling and disturbing they were. And so he ran into this problem where he would get a contract or come close to getting a contract. Then a printer or an editor would read the story and say, there's no way I can print this. It's libelous or it's slanderous. Or did you not get the sort of sexual innuendos that are going on in this story? There's no way that we can publish this and not be sued or prosecuted by the authorities. And so Joyce had this process of getting the book almost accepted and then rejected, almost accepted and then rejected for a whole variety of different reasons. At one point, in fact, the entire book had already been printed, set, ready to bind, and a printer or an editor at the last moment realized that one of the stories contained a number of potentially libelous claims. Joyce tried to fight back against this idea to no avail, and the editor guillotined, which literally just kind of cut in half the proofs and destroyed them for the book. So this Joyce, in the process of this, wrote an essay called A Curious History about his struggle with printers, and it's one of those things that actually helped create the story of James Joyce, or at least the kind of epic story of James Joyce as this utterly uncompromising author who wouldn't change a word, a period, a comma, or a sentence to get a book published, and would stand by his work no matter what. We sort of see that happening in Joyce's Dubliners, and it really is a kind of core origin story for the larger Joyce myth. Um, it also reminds us, I think, that this is a collection in which you can read these stories and think, oh, that's sort of nice, that's sort of strange. But the more you read them, as those early editors and printers did, the more unsettled you might become by what the story might be alluding to or what it might involve. And I think Eveline is one of those stories. As I said, it was written in 1904, one of the very first pieces for the collection. And the book itself sort of divides into roughly three sections that Joyce described as youth, uh, maturity, and public life. This is one of the youth stories, and it describes a young woman in Dublin who is trying to decide whether or not to leave home. It's actually one of the reasons I chose this story. As we all find ourselves confined now, I thought, why not focus on a story that's all about the question of whether or not you should leave home? And that the answer to that question is one of the things that makes this story quite interesting, in fact. So I think that's really all you need to know. I should caution you that I am not an actor or a professional reader, though I certainly read this kind of thing out to my students all the time. So this is going to be something of an experiment to me as I read Eveline. But I hope you'll enjoy this story. And as I finish the story, I urge you to ask some questions and make some comments in the chat boxes on the side of this event, on the side of this live stream. And at the same time, I'll ask some questions at the end as well that might get you thinking about some of the things that are going on in this story. So let's begin with James Joyce's short story from 1904, part of the collection called Dubliners. The story is titled Eveline. She sat at the window, watching the evening invade the avenue. Her head was leaned against the window curtains, and in her nostrils was the odor of dusty cretonne. She was tired. Few people passed. The man out of the last house passed on his way home. She heard footsteps clacking along the concrete pavement, and afterwards crunching on the cinder path before the new red houses. One time there used to be a field there, in which they used to play every evening with other people's children. Then a man from Belfast bought the field and built houses in it. Not like their little brown houses, but bright brick houses with shining roofs. The children of the avenue used to play together in that field. The Devines, the Waters, the Dunns, little Keogh, the cripple, she and her brothers and sisters. Ernest, however, never played. He was too grown up. Her father used often to hunt them out of the field with his blackthorn stick, but usually little Keogh used to keep nix and call out when he saw her father coming. Still, they seemed to have been rather happy then. Her father was not so bad then. And besides, her mother was alive. That was a long time ago. She and her brothers and sisters were all grown up. Her mother was dead. Tizzie Dunn was dead, too, and the Waters had gone back to England. Everything changes. Now she was going to go away like the others, to leave her home. Home! She looked around the room, reviewing all its familiar objects which she had dusted once a week for so many years, wondering where on earth all the dust came from. Perhaps she would never see again those familiar objects from which she had never dreamed of being divided. And yet, during all those years, she had never found out the name of the priest, whose yellowing photograph hung on the wall above the broken harmonium, beside the colored print of the promises made to Blessed Margaret Mary Alacoque. He'd been a school friend of her father. Whenever he showed the photograph to a visitor, her father used to pass it with a casual word. He's in Melbourne now. She had consented to go away, to leave her home. Was that wise? She tried to weigh each side of the question. In her home, anyway, she had shelter and food. She had those whom she had known all her life about her. Of course, she had to work hard, both in the house and at business. What would they say of her in the stores when they found out that she had run away with a fellow? Say that she was a fool, perhaps, and her place would be filled up by advertisement. Miss Gavin would be glad. She had always had an edge on her, especially whenever there were people listening. Miss Hill, don't you see there are ladies waiting? Look lively, Miss Hill, please. She would not cry many tears about leaving the stores. But in her new home, in a distant, unknown country, it would not be like that. Then she would be married. She, Eveline. People would treat her with respect then. She would not be treated as her mother had been. Even now, though she was over 19, she sometimes felt herself in danger of her father's violence. She knew it was that had given her the palpitations. When they were growing up, he had never gone for her like he used to go for Harry and Ernest, because she was a girl. But, latterly, he had begun to threaten her and say what he would do to her only for her dead mother's sake. And now she had nobody to protect her. Ernest was dead, and Harry, who was in the church decorating business, was nearly always down somewhere in the country. Besides, the invariable squabble for money on Saturday nights had begun to weary her unspeakably. She always gave her entire wages, 7 shillings, and Harry always sent up what he could, but the trouble was to get any money out of her father. He said she used to squander the money, that she had no head, that he wasn't going to give her his hard-earned money to throw about the streets, and much more, for he usually was fairly bad on Saturday night. In the end, he would give her the money and ask her had she had any intention of buying Sunday's dinner. Then she had to rush out as quickly as she could and do her marketing, holding her black leather purse tightly in her hand as she elbowed her way through the crowds and returning home late under the load of her provisions. She had hard work to keep the house together, and to see that the 2 young children who had been left to her charge went to school regularly and got their meals regularly. It was hard work, a hard life. But now that she was about to leave it, she did not find it a wholly undesirable life. She was about to explore another life with Frank. Frank was very kind, manly, open-hearted. She was to go away with him by the night boat, to be his wife, and to live with him in Buenos Aires, where he had a home waiting for her. How well she remembered the first time she had seen him. He was lodging in a house on the main road where she used to visit. It seemed a few weeks ago. He was standing at the gate, his peaked cap pushed back on his head, and his hair tumbled forward over a face of bronze. Then they had come to know each other. He used to meet her outside the stores every evening and see her home. He took her to see The Bohemian Girl, and she felt elated as she sat in an unaccustomed part of the theater with him. He was awfully fond of music and sang a little. People knew they were courting, and when he sang about the lass that loves a sailor, she always felt pleasantly confused. He used to call her Poppins out of fun. First of all, it had been an excitement for her to have a fellow, and then she had begun to like him. He had tales of distant countries. He had started as a deck boy uh, at £1 a month on a ship of the Allen Line going out to Canada. He told her the names of the ships he had been on and the names of the different services. He had sailed through the Straits of Magellan, and he told her stories of the terrible Patagonians. He had fallen on his feet in Buenos Aires, he said, and had come over to the old country just for a holiday. Of course, her father had found out the affair and had forbidden her to have anything to say to him. "I know those sailor chaps," he said. One day he had quarreled with Frank, and after that she had to meet her lover secretly. The evening deepened in the avenue. The white of 2 letters in her lap grew indistinct. One was to Harry, the other was to her father. Ernest had been her favorite, but she liked Harry too. Her father was becoming old lately, she noticed. He would miss her. Sometimes he could be very nice. Not long before, when she had been laid up for a day, he had read her out a ghost story and made toast for her at the fire. Another day, when their mother was alive, they had all gone for a picnic to the Hill of Howth. She remembered her father putting on her mother's bonnet to make the children laugh. Her time was running out, but she continued to sit by the window, leaning her head against the window curtain, inhaling the odor of dusty cretonne. Down far in the avenue, she could hear a street organ playing. She knew the air. Strange that it had come that very night to remind her of the promise to her mother, her promise to keep the home together as long as she could. She remembered the last night of her mother's illness. She was again in that close, dark room at the other side of the hall, and outside she heard a melancholy air of Italy. The organ player had been ordered to go away and given sixpence. She remembered her father strutting back into the sick room, saying, "Damned Italians coming over here." As she mused, the pitiful vision of her mother's life laid its spell on the very quick of her being. That life of commonplace sacrifices closing in final craziness. She trembled as she heard again her mother's voice saying constantly with foolish insistence, "Daravan, Saran, Daravan, Saran." She stood up in a sudden impulse of terror. Escape! She must escape. Frank would save her. He would give her life, perhaps love too, but she wanted to live. Why should she be unhappy? She had a right to happiness. Frank would take her in his arms, fold her in his arms. He would save her. She stood among the swaying crowds in the station at the north wall. He held her hand, and she knew that he was speaking to her, saying something about the passage over and over again. The station was full of soldiers with brown baggages. Through the wide doors of the sheds, she caught a glimpse of the black mass of the boat lying in beside the quay wall, with illumined portholes. She answered nothing. She felt her cheek pale and cold, and out of a maze of distress, she prayed to God to direct her, to show her what was her duty. The boat blew a loud, mournful whistle into the mist. If she went, tomorrow she would be on the sea with Frank, steaming toward Buenos Aires. Their passage had been booked. Could she still draw back after all he had done for her? Her distress awoke a nausea in her body, and she kept moving her lips in silent, fervent prayer. A bell clanged upon her heart. She felt him seize her hand. "Come!" All the seas of the world tumbled about her heart. He was drawing her into them. He would drown her. She gripped with both hands at the iron railing. "Come!" No, 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 it was impossible. Her hands clutched the iron in frenzy. Amid the seas, she sent a cry of anguish. "Eveline! Evie!" He rushed beyond the barrier and called to her to follow. He was shouted at to go on, but he still called to her. She set her white face to him, passive, like a helpless animal. Her eyes gave him no sign of love or farewell or recognition. The end. So that's James Joyce's Eveline, a story that Joyce wrote in 1904 and that was published as part of the collection called Dubliners in 1914. It's a confusing and strange and interesting story for a variety of reasons. And I think some of the questions that this story raises are pretty clear, and I'll want to talk about those for at least a moment or two here in just a moment. But first, I want to let us just sit with the story for a moment. Perhaps if you happen to have a cocktail with you, or a beer, or a glass of wine, take a sip. Try to imagine yourself in Eveline's place. Try to imagine the world in which she felt herself pulled between Frank on the one hand and what sounds like a terrible, perhaps frightening home life on the other. What would you do in such a situation? What has happened to Eveline as she stands at the edge of a dock? Let's think about that for a moment. And while we do, I want to remind you one more time that tonight, anyway, I'm drinking a cocktail called the Massey that was created for us by our friends at the Starlight Bar here in Tulsa. These are difficult times for those who work in that business, so I want to remind you to take a moment, maybe tip the bartender if you can. Watch the video that she made for us in which she explains how to make this delicious cocktail. Even a small amount of tips that we can provide here will go a long way for people who are in distress right now. So we'll just take a drink here for a moment, and then I'll ask you some questions about Eveline and maybe offer a few thoughts on my own reading of this strange and unusual story. So I think one of the first and most interesting questions or let me provide actually a little bit of context for this story, the idea of Eveline leaving Ireland. I suspect that for many of you who live in the United States or in North America and claim any kind of Irish descent, you'll know something about this story. You'll know something about the generations after generations of people who fled desperate conditions in Ireland, conditions of poverty, right, of suffering sort of at the hands of the British Empire, starvation, of uncertain futures, and often made their way to the shores of other stops within the Anglophone world, certainly Canada, the United States, and Australia, New Zealand, among many others. The outflow of people from Ireland over the course of about a century, from 1850 to say 1950, was absolutely extraordinary. In 1841, the population of the country was roughly 6.5 million people. By 1936, the start of the First World War, that population had been more than cut in half, down to 3 million people. The country had essentially emptied. Can you imagine half of the people simply disappearing over the course of 1 or 2 generations? And of course, they made their way, like my family did, to the United States and to all of these other places and created this giant wave of Irish immigration throughout the world. And so part of what we hear in this story is Eveline caught up in that same sort of tide and asking herself, should she leave or should she go? Should she remain at a home that remains familiar to her? Or should she give up everything she knows for this very strange, uncertain, maybe even dangerous future that this mysterious sailor named Frank has offered her on the far side of the world, a place called Buenos Aires, a place I'm sure someone like Eveline had almost no knowledge of in turn of the century Dublin. So the story raises for us the question, what is home? What is it about? Now, there are a lot of ways for us to approach this story. And again, I want to urge you, if you have some questions or some comments, to please make them on the side of the screen here. Use the comment book for this live stream. It's going to be even better if I can respond to some of the things that you're asking and thinking and wondering about this book. I can't necessarily offer complete answers. I think one of the mysteries, one of the pleasures of this story is the fact that it withholds so much information that we need to know. Right? Most notably and most strikingly, that moment at the very end of the story, if you think about it, we've spent this entire story locked inside of one person's mind, right? This young girl sitting there, wondering if she should leave home, thinking about it, weighing the different kinds of opportunities that are available to her, right? Goes to the waterfront with Frank, seems to be ready to get onto the boat, and then all of a sudden the story cuts away from her consciousness. She seems to be, as the story says, passive. Right? Her consciousness essentially disappears. She doesn't know herself, and thus we can't know what's going on. Why hasn't she moved? Why is she clinging to the iron railing? What is she afraid of? Right, so that's one of Joyce's sort of most masterful moves in the story, is to withhold that little bit of information that we need at just the last possible moment. And it leaves us, kind of like Eveline herself, floundering in uncertainty. We don't know what to ask, what to think, what's going on. We're left in the same sort of feeling of indecision that Eveline herself is experiencing. So I've got a couple of questions coming in here on the comments. And one of those is the question, does Frank exist? Are we sure that Frank exists? I think that's a terrific question. And like so much in Joyce's stories, I don't think we know the answer to that. I'd be love to know if you have thoughts on this, to maybe add your comments here on the side. What do you think? Is Frank a real person in this story? I do think there's maybe something of a clue. I mean, there's something about that name that I think we're worried about. For my part, I'm relatively sure that Frank exists. I don't have any more evidence to support that than anyone else does. But does Frank actually offer her exactly what he seems to be offering her? Right? Even that word, that name, Frank, which means honest or truthful, right? Joyce is a master of irony, of course. And so are we sure Frank is being frank with Evaline? Buenos Aires? That seems like a pretty random choice, actually, as a place to go and leave Ireland. And after just a few weeks, I think Evaline says 6 weeks, they're going to get married, right? They've already made this decision. She's going to leave her home, travel to the far side of the world. Frank may not be all that he seems to be in other words. Now, you're right, as Wayne Green is commenting here on the side, that he might well be just a fantasy, an excuse to leave, that this is Evaline locked in her own conscience, and he's a sort of the fantasy that she needs to help her escape Ireland, a sort of psychic mechanism to give her the courage to go, courage that fails her ultimately when she's standing at the dock. I don't really know the answer to that question. I don't think we can answer that question because we're so locked inside of Evaline's mind. There's no narrator that stands outside of the story that can assure us that Frank is or isn't real, that can tell us Frank is a man of good intentions, or perhaps Frank is recruiting her to a life of prostitution. I think that's certainly a question that we need to consider in this book, right? This might well be something like what in the time period was called white slavery and what we would now call human trafficking, right? Evaline sort of fits all of those categories. A young woman with an insecure home, an abusive home, as near as we can tell. Her father, we know, is violent, seems to be threatening her with violence, right? She has every reason in the world to leave, but she's also therefore has very little knowledge of the world, is very easily seduced by Frank, and maybe Frank is luring her into a life of prostitution. This boat that she's getting on is itself not heading, and this is an important point, I think. The boat she's getting on is not itself heading to Buenos Aires. It's the night boat that's taking them most likely to Liverpool, just across the Irish Channel. And she's not really going that far from home, right? She's only going just far enough away that someone like Frank could invent an opportunity to perhaps give her just a little place to stay or stay with him, or there's just been a delay in our travel. You can imagine all kinds of alternative stories that might play out here that give us some real doubts about Frank. And as I said, because there's no third person narrator in the story, we just don't know. We don't know what to make of Frank, and we don't really know what to make of Evaline's own psychic world either, right? We only have Evaline's opinion of herself. All right, we've got a couple of other questions in here. I'm actually going to read a couple of these out and just see if we can think about them. So Annie Page here writes that I find it poignant that she's reminded of the promise she made to her mother. She's caught between a desire to find the freedom and seek fun, but hesitates giving in to the impulse that she worries is selfish. And I think that's right. I think many of us, if you have older parents or maybe grandparents, you've been caught in similar situations, finding yourself making a promise to a parent or a grandparent about a future that you can't control, that's inevitably going to be uncertain. Please don't put me in a nursing home, for example. Please let never this or that happen to me. Or in this case, Evaline's mother saying, you must keep the home together, which when Evaline's told this, she might be 16 years old. Imagine at that age being told essentially that you have to become the mother. And in this case, we know this is a mother that she has witnessed be physically abused by her husband. And it's a mother that she has watched descend into some kind of mental illness. That quotation, that Derivan Saran that she imagines her mother reciting again and again at the end. This has been the subject of endless debate among Joyce scholars. What does that actually mean? I suspect some early English readers might have thought, oh, maybe that must be Irish. It must be a non-English language, and I just don't understand it. I don't necessarily think that's the case at all. We've not been able to devise in years and decades now of looking at this story what that language actually means. It may simply be nonsense syllables. And what's happened to Evaline is she's watched her mother slip into mental illness, and she's charged at the last moment right? With this duty of caring for her younger siblings, of trying to hold an abusive home together. I agree with Annie that it is a terribly poignant and difficult moment that makes this decision that Eveline faces even more difficult for her to navigate. Is there even a right choice to make here? I mean, I think ultimately that's one of the challenges of this story as well. You can't make the right choice. There's not an easy choice for Eveline to make. This isn't something like Jane Eyre, right, with that reader, I married him at the end, where we have a happy ending or a marriage plot and we know things are going to work out. There seems to only be something like catastrophe lurking here. She only has two choices, and both of those choices may well be bad. All right, let's see. We have a couple of other questions here that I'll try to answer. Carol asks, would Eveline have suspected Frank of trying to exploit her, but refused to recognize that until she was being urged to leave? Maybe that's why she freezes. It's challenging. As I said, I can't imagine. We are denied the opportunity to know why she freezes at the railing, right? And it's such a powerful and poignant scene. The cries of no, 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 the seas of the world tumbling about her heart. It's some of Joyce's most powerful and I think um, evocative and expressive language. It's not quite sentimental. It doesn't quite go over the top, but it comes very close. This is from a writer who's usually very ironic and holds distance always holds language at something of a critical distance from himself. It's hard not to feel ourselves like Eveline being drowned essentially in the impossibility of the moment that she faces there. Uh, and maybe she does have an epiphany. That was a story. I should maybe say something about epiphanies. Joyce, some of his very first prose experiments, and Joyce initially imagined himself as being a poet and maybe a dramatist before becoming a prose writer. And he wrote some of his very earliest experiments with sort of poetic language were things called epiphanies, often 3 to 5 or 7 line sort of observations of life in Dublin around him, often taken from the crudest sort of circumstances, in which he tried to describe the scene, thinking that these little moments of day-to-day life, right? Seeing someone like Eveline standing on the docks, watching, and elsewhere in the collection, for example, watching a young boy go to a sort of fair at the end of the day and realize all the stalls were sold out and it was not as exciting or as interesting as he hoped it would be, watching his disappointment. Joyce believed that these little moments of everyday life, that in them we may have something like an epiphany, right? That a word that for us means that greatest moment of revelation, a revelation essentially of the divine in the human world. And Joyce looked for that not in sacred texts, not in the Bible, not in the Catholic Church in which he was raised, but in the day-to-day life or in the day-to-day experience of our lives, right? He believed that even the crudest of objects, the crudest of experiences, could open up some fundamental mystery of life for him. And so it may be that what happens to Eveline is that she's standing on the dock. She has something like an epiphany. She realizes that Frank is not what he seems to be. Perhaps he's not real. Perhaps she realizes there's no real escape from her circumstances. Perhaps she realizes that home is better than going away. We haven't talked much about that fact because home here seems so terrible, but even those who decide to flee home never do so easily, right? Home is always this thing that we want to hold close to our hearts, close to our minds. It's what nurtures us. It's what we want to nurture us anyway. And it's never a thing that we can easily leave behind. So perhaps that is what happens with Eveline standing there. Perhaps she does have one of these moments of epiphany and thus invite us into her epiphany as well. All right, let's see. We have a couple of other questions here that I might be able to answer. I know early someone asked, yes, here, let's see, David and Lisa Williams have asked, is the mother actually Ireland? I think that's absolutely the case. There's certainly a symbolic reading of the story in which this is about, which was very much a concern. I mean, as the Ireland of the Edwardian era in which Joyce was writing was one that had just suffered essentially through a failed attempt at revolution. They had failed to break away from the British Empire at the end of the 19th century and had settled into a period of brief but relatively quiet domestic politics. But there was nevertheless a deep and abiding urge to cultivate Ireland, right? To help it escape from this colonial relationship that it had to its neighbor across the sea, a relationship that according to some theories, had led to things like the Great Famine that ravaged the countryside and led to mass death and mass immigration. And so Irish authorities, Irish cultural leaders, Irish religious leaders were urging Irish people to stay home, to rebuild the country. And you see some of this energy emerge about 10 years after Joyce writes this story in 1916, when we get the first really violent revolution within Ireland in the 20th century as a group of radical revolutionaries in the middle of World War I, right? While the British are off fighting in the fields of Flanders and France, seize control of the middle of Dublin. And it leads to a terrible catastrophe. Many of the revolutionary leaders are shot by the British authorities after a brief battle, and the British themselves sail a gunship up the Liffey River, which would be something like sailing a gunship up the middle of the Hudson, and begin essentially to shell the center of the city, demolishing many buildings, killing many people, and putting down this insurrection in Easter 1916. Nevertheless, those revolutionary energies would lead to the liberation of Ireland in 1922 and to its creation as an independent republic. So I think that that's an important context for this story is Irish nationalism and this notion that this woman should not leave. Eveline should not leave. She should, in fact, remain at home, should, in fact, remain loyal to Ireland. There are many essays being written at this time about that need to stay home, a concern about what one cultural commentator called the double leak in Ireland, the fact that many of the strongest and healthiest people were leaving Ireland, right? So there was this leak of population through immigration, and then as a result, a lot of the population that was left behind was sick or ill or unable to care for itself, leading to this other sort of leak, that is, of productive people just leaking out of Irish society. It was essentially hollowing out the country as a whole. So I think we definitely should not forget the Irish context here, and the fact that Joyce at this time, though always deeply suspicious of Ireland, and it's probably worth noting and remembering that though Joyce was born and raised in Ireland and has created perhaps the most important record of Irish life in the early part of the 20th century, Joyce never had an Irish passport. Even after they attained independence, Joyce kept a British passport throughout his entire life, and was in fact married in Britain rather than in Ireland. All right, we have one or two other questions here I might be able to answer here. Oh, Wayne asks, what is it that she's smelling to? Cretone is one of those words that's now archaic. It really is just a kind of cotton fabric. But it is weird that she repeats that. It's an unusual word. It's, as I said, essentially archaic now. And we might ask ourselves, what is that dust that's falling over her? It gives us the impression from early on that as Eveline's sitting there, she wonders, where does all this dust come from? Well, it seems to be falling not only on the apartment, but on her, right? The longer that she sits here in this twilight, the more this dust is settling over her, right? The more that the cretone, the fabric that she's describing that the curtains are made of, may be becoming something like a funeral shroud that's enwrapping her, and this dust is the dirt being thrown over her grave, right? We see a young girl potentially being buried here, and that's part of why she so desperately needs to escape, right? It's when she thinks about her mother's death, right, her mother's funeral, that she leaps up and says, that's enough, I must go. All right, well, let's see, we have a couple of other questions here that I might be able to answer. So this says, her ending with us knowing what she does contributes to, how does this ending contribute to the overall theme of paralysis and Dubliners? So Joyce, when he was desperately trying to get this book published, described it as many things. He called it as essentially a looking glass held up to the Irish race. He called it a study in hemiplegia, a very poignant word for us to use right now, which means a kind of fevered illness, right? He believed that the Irish people were seized by a kind of hemiplegia, by a fever that was essentially destroying them. So he did not intend for these to be portraits of warm humanity and happiness. There are no happy endings in Dubliners. There's only disappointment and confusion in each of these stories. And he described the Irish themselves, or the Irish of Dublin, as essentially being paralyzed. He called the book a study in paralysis. And we often get many of these stories end with precisely that, with the main character or narrator frozen, standing in front of a window, uncertain what to do. thinking back on something that had happened in their lives, uncertain what to do, watching um, a light be put out, uncertain what to do. And here we see Eveline powerfully clutching those iron railings at the dock, wondering what it is she should do. Right. So that notion of paralysis is essential here. It's a book, I think there's a more optimistic reading perhaps of Dubliners, in which we see this as a sort of, preface to Joyce's later works, by which I mean this is the study in paralysis, and later books like Portrait of the Artist to some degree, but certainly Ulysses, offer a way forward that Joyce himself feels seized by a kind of artistic and nationalist and linguistic paralysis. And so all he can do is record it in Dubliners. And by the time he gets to Ulysses, he's beginning to invent a new kind of language. He's beginning to invent a way to escape that paralysis, a new way to imagine Ireland, right? Where we have a character in that book, famously Leopold Bloom, the sort of core of Ulysses, the core protagonist in Ulysses, is not himself is himself a sort of a Jewish man who's got origins in Europe and has come to Ireland and is viewed suspiciously by many others. It's a kind of early, we might call it now, a multicultural novel, and he begins to understand that Ireland is itself a complex place of many different histories and peoples, and that is actually the solution to the paralysis, rather than a kind of easy or obvious nationalism or anti-colonialism of the kind we might see in Dubliners. All right, well, our time is drawing to an end, and so I want to offer, and I know we have a couple of other questions here, but I do want to offer one last thought here that might be useful. And to do this, I want to borrow from another critic named Margot Norris, who wrote what I consider the master study of Joyce's Dubliners, called Suspicious Readings, in which she goes through and treats each of these stories one by one. And as one of the great Joyce critics, really, of our generation, she gives us a new insight into each one of these stories with the readings that she offers. And she does this often by reading against the grain, by making us think about the stories in different ways. And in part with Eveline, she insists that one of the things that we need to understand about Dubliners is that this book, this collection of stories, is not necessarily about the characters themselves, but about us. That is, this book is an experiment that when we read it, we perform on ourselves. So let me give you an example of what she means here. And I should say, she calls this in a wonderful turn of phrase. She calls this the poisonous touch of the reader. That because these stories are so uncertain, because they don't give us any kind of definitive answers, we have no choice but to act and interpret them. We have to decide, what is it that's happened to Eveline at the railing? What exactly is going on in her life? And there are questions like that that shape each of these stories. And as a result, we are required to interact with these stories. They make us do something to them, right? And she says, the moment we start doing that thing, we can't help but bring some element of poison into the narrative. We might, in this case, for example, either condemn Eveline, though not knowing much about her circumstances, for remaining frozen at the railing, right? And when I teach this to students here at the University of Tulsa, of course, they're always initially saying, no, she should leave. She should go with Frank. She should live her life. This is a terrible thing to be trapped at home. She's such a fool for remaining stuck there at the end, right? And they're poisoning the story somewhat by interpreting Eveline in one way. If you follow the kind of reading that I suggested earlier, where we think about Frank as perhaps a human trafficker, right? I've injected a different kind of poison into this story and said, for God's sake, don't leave with him, Eveline. He's going to lead to an even worse life. You've already led this terrible life. It's better to sort of face what you've got here. At least you have a job. You've got a possible future here that's going to be very different from a life of sort of suffering and abuse that Frank may bring to you if you travel with him. But again, I've injected that sort of poisonous reading into the story, and there's no way to therefore read Eveline in a neutral way. All that's left is the poisonous touch that we bring to these stories. And thus, what happens when we read the Dubliner stories is that we're taking our own temperature. We're diagnosing ourselves. We're revealing our suspicions, our fears, our anxieties, our ways of being suspicious or ironic or doubtful about the world. And that process means that the minute you start to talk about this story, perhaps with someone else, you start to reveal perhaps more of yourself than you want to. This is a story that withholds so very many details that we need, right? It holds all of that back and makes us rush in to fill the gap. And in rushing in, we reveal far more of ourselves perhaps than we ever intended to do just by picking up a story and reading it. All right, well, our time here is drawing to an end, so I want to thank you once again for joining us for the first of these Humanities Happy Hours. I want to remind you that we'll be doing this now weekly, at least for the next several weeks. We're going to remain on a shelter-in-place order here in Tulsa through at least the month of April. I suspect we'll be continuing this through May as well. We've lined up a terrific series of events that will be live streaming every Thursday at 5 o'clock. I can't guarantee these are always going to happen in Facebook. We're looking at some other platforms as well. But we have a number of other events coming up. If you didn't hear me at the top of the show, we have something called the Corona Cabaret next week, where a professor of musical theory here at, or professor of musical theater here at Tulsa will be singing and performing some virus-themed songs, it turns out, and we'll be joined the week after that for a movie discussion with a physician and member of our medical faculty here who will be talking about the film Contagion, and we're lining up a number of other events as well. And each of those is going to be paired with some kind of cocktail so that this is an opportunity at the end of the day for you to sit down, have a drink with us, have a conversation with us, and do what we can to maintain some kind of human connection during these difficult and distanced times. Now, the last thing I want to say before we go and close out for the evening is to please remember, tonight, I've said this many times, I'm drinking what's called a Massey cocktail that's been created here by Lynn Robertson from the Starlight Bar here in Tulsa on 11th Street. We'll be reaching out to different bartenders and restaurateurs every week and asking them to create cocktails to go with our events. We'll post in advance a number of how-to videos basically on how to make these cocktails so that you can mix it and enjoy it with us. But the most important thing I can urge you to do right now is to take a moment to tip your bartender. You'll see in the side conversation here that there are links to a PayPal account where you can go and toss a couple of dollars to people who are really suffering and in difficult times right now as bars and restaurants throughout the country are closed down. So please, if you can, if it's possible for you, take a moment to tip your bartender. And I hope that I'll see you all again next week at Humanities Happy Hour, where we begin with the Corona Cabaret. In the meantime, I hope you stay healthy, I hope you take care of yourselves, and I hope you're helping take care of your communities. You have our best wishes from the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, and I'll see you in a week. Goodbye. Well, I say goodbye, but I have to figure out how to turn this thing off. All right, goodbye.